And welcome back to our Ohio Votes coverage, our first time streaming cast here involving WBNS, WTOL, and WKYC. And we are joined also by a cadre of political experts this evening. University of Cincinnati political science professor Dr. David Niven, as well as Ohio Wesleyan political science professor Dr. Brianna Mack, and my colleague, of course, Station Aken from here at WBNS. And we want to talk more about the U.S. Senate race and the differences now. We had Sherrod Brown, former Senator Sherrod Brown, served 3 terms before losing to Senator Bernie Moreno, a year and a half ago, basically. Senator Jon Husted has been in office for just over a year. And we're heading into this new general election season. So what are the differences that you two see? We'll start with you, Dr. Niven, between Sherrod Brown's opponents. You had Bernie Moreno 2 years ago, and now Senator Husted. What's the difference between who he's facing?
Right. Well, I mean, you start with the reality. All right, so Sherrod Brown is the same person 2 years later. Always in character. He's going to have the same message. So then what changes? One, of course, top of the ticket's different. There's no Trump in 2026. The other thing now is, who's he running against? Moreno, he portrayed as, kind of this cartoonish, car salesman, and, ran against him as this kind of over-the-top character. Husted, of course, has been in office for 25 years, so the very different dynamic of running against something of a political institution instead of running against an outsider. And I think this race, what it'll have in common with the race from 2024 is it will be inordinately personal. It will be attacks on Jon Husted. That's what you do. That's how you run this race. On the other side, it's a little bit of a different dynamic for Republicans running against Brown without the tailwinds of that presidential race. They're gonna have to work harder, to take this race down.
How do you think that the money factors in? Because we know both of these campaigns, the Husted campaign, the Brown campaign, there's a lot of money backing both of these candidates. How will that play a part in how voters show up?
Well, I think the money will ultimately drive the amount of ads that we see. I'm thinking about 2024, and it felt like every 5 minutes there was a Senate ad.
We're seeing it already, yes.
I know. So instead of every 5 minutes, it might be every 3 minutes. So, everyone get ready. We're going to have a lot of ads. But I think with that much ads inundating everybody, I think that, folks will also want to be expecting perhaps to hear from candidates straight up or directly from them. So I'm actually curious to see if they're actually going to hold a debate because, we didn't get that debate like I wanted in 2024.
So based on what Dr. Niven said, and it sounds like your thought process on this, probably not going to be perhaps a substance campaign, more of a character campaign, do you think? Are we going to hear about issues, or are we going to hear about failings of, back and forth between the two?
I mean, I can see there being, an attack of failures, just throwing them back and forth. I mean, Brown lost, right? And of course, Husted right now he's dealing with these current event failures right now. And so we have to see how long these current event failures will plague him or will continue to plague the national GOP as a whole.
But they do disagree on substance. I mean, that's part of what, what's interesting about this. And I think the same could be said on the governor's race. These are two candidates who truly disagree with each other on the basics of policy, which direction to take things. And I think with respect to Brown and Husted, they would probably disagree on every issue that comes before the Senate, between now and the election.
And that money issue, too. We're just seeing the start of it now with these 2 PACs.
Right.
Other PACs are probably going to get involved as well, because you'll hear a lot from the campaigns about how much money they've raised. The candidates have raised for their campaigns. We're looking, I forget what the money was, $16 million on hand for Sherrod Brown, I think $8 million on hand for Husted, but that's just what the campaigns have raised. But the real money is spent
outside the control of the campaign. I mean, typically in those top featured Senate races, we're seeing, the candidates themselves be responsible for maybe a quarter of total spending, and the vast majority of the campaign is actually outside of their control. And it's a remarkable development, but it's a reflection of the fact that, folks across the country care about who controls the Senate. And so an Ohio Senate race matters to a Democratic or Republican party everywhere in this country.
And this could be the most important Senate race of all the contested races, right?
Again, they're all important, but I think
closest?
the most uncertain. That's the thing that's going to really animate this. Nobody knows who's going to win, which means donate more.
Do you think we're going to hear from the candidates more? Because these are two candidates, at least from a media perspective, they're very difficult to get a hold of, especially in recent months. These are not candidates necessarily who are open with speaking to the media. Do you think they're going to let their commercials do the talking, or do you think we're going to hear from them in a more
directly?
personal way? Yeah. And to your point, a possible debate, might that be important to separate themselves?
I mean, I would love for them to have a debate. However, for Husted, as he's the incumbent, there's actually no reason for him to actually engage in a debate or to do any public interactions right now, because he's already in office, and barring any unforeseen scandals that may or may not exist out there, all he has to do is, do an ad here, do an ad there, a couple of tweets, some YouTube videos, and then maybe, shake a couple hands, kiss a couple babies, and just ride out until November. But, Brown has this uphill battle of having to reintroduce himself, as well as, kiss these babies and shake hands and get this money. But Husted, as the incumbent, he has laurels that he can rest on that Brown no longer has.
I want to hear from both of these folks. I mean, you are our political reporter, Doug, and I feel like when Husted was lieutenant governor, he was very accessible to the media. And as a senator, he's been a little tougher to engage with.
I found that it's come in waves, really, because he put forth his, I knew it was going to slip my mind right now, but he put forth a bill that would kind of end the benefits cliff for people who make a little bit too much money and they lose their federal benefits. That was one thing that he wanted to talk about. He came on and talked about that in an interview that I aired on Face the State. Been a couple other opportunities as well. But as far as, in the campaign realm of the things, no. In his official office, yes, I've interviewed him a few times, but not so much with campaign type issues.
And then Sherrod Brown, I feel like, when we were trying to figure out if he was going to run, we couldn't even figure out who to talk to call to ask him, because it was so difficult to get a hold of him. So I just wonder if that's going to change.
It was so fresh that they didn't have staff put together either yet.
On the Husted side,
no,
or the
on
Brown
the Sherrod
side?
Brown campaign side, and with Senator Husted in the early months, his appointment happened quickly.
Right.
He talked about basically living out of a hotel for a while. He says that they put him in a Senate office that was basically a closet for a while. It probably wasn't a closet, but it was like that. It was like, hey, here's a temporary space. Start working out of here. You don't have no staff yet. And so it was difficult, but he was just trying to get his feet under him in Washington in a brand new position without a full staff yet.
Is there a benefit to hearing from these two candidates, or do they just go in the direction of letting the commercials speak? What's the benefit?
I mean, certainly on Husted, even though he has been in statewide office in Ohio for 16 years, he's not actually all that well known by Ohioans. If you asked the average Ohioan, the polling shows they don't know what to associate him with. They don't, what defines him. He's certainly, presented himself as, a Trump-supporting Republican, but not in a way that distinguishes himself from all the other Trump-supporting Republicans. So, I do think Husted will at some point have to try and create an identity. Brown has done that over the course of his career. He's, talks about the dignity of work. He talks about, these kinds of things that are always in his message. Pro-labor things. But, obviously they want to control the setting. So they'd love for you to come and Brown would love for you to come and record him talking to, senior citizens at a discussion or something like that.
That is true. We do get a lot of invitations. You see them from around the state, hey, former Senator Brown will be talking with Ohioans affected by such and such an issue in a roundtable. Dr. Acton has done the same thing as well on affordability issues. We're going to go back to Lena Lai right now as we continue this discussion on the U.S. Senate race and looking at some of the numbers coming in from tonight.
Yeah, let's take a closer look at some of the results. Of course, Sherrod Brown, the projected winner of the U.S. Senate Democratic primary in all of Ohio, 89.9% versus Ron Kincaid with 10.1%. And we all wanted to see how strong of a win did Sherrod Brown get tonight. So, let's take a look at some of the Democratic strongholds. You have Cuyahoga County, 94.7%. Let's take a look at Franklin County. 90%. Ron Kincaid, 10%. Let's take a look at how he did in Cincinnati, 90.8%. Let's see, check our friends in Lucas County, 92.7%. And as I talked about earlier, what I was interested in trying to see how things unfolded tonight. By the way, this is total is 47% reporting for all of Ohio. I was interested to find out how Sherrod Brown would do with his Mahoning Valley base. So we take a look at Mahoning County. 88.9%, Ron Kincaid 11.1%. Trumbull County 88.3%, 11.7% to Ron Kincaid. So I'm wondering, Dr. Niven, does this say anything, or are we splitting hairs here?
It says a little something. It says, that Brown was not seriously, pushed by this campaign, and that, the default setting was certainly to support him. Still, I think, breaking 10% against him is a slight, matter for concern. You want to dominate in these elections full tilt, of course.
And Lena, why don't you come back over here when you get a second, and we
Okay.
can continue the discussion with Dr. Niven on these numbers, because we were looking at that same kind of situation with the gubernatorial race
Right.
as well, with Vivek Ramaswamy. The latest numbers we saw from that was, I think, still about 85
Right.
to 15% over his Republican opponent, Casey Putsch.
Right, but the concern there with losing 15% to a relatively unknown candidate, certainly somebody who didn't have the money, didn't have the the infrastructure behind them, are some of those folks going to stay home in November? Are some of those folks going to vote Libertarian or do something other than back Ramaswamy? You don't know, obviously, what those Kincaid voters against Sherrod Brown, are thinking, but it seems less likely that that's, a protest vote that's going to leave them out of the equation voting in November.
They just wanted
Yeah,
Kincaid to win.
Or, certain people are kind of just picking names, out of a hat, and that's going to happen sometimes.
And Lena's back here at the table with us. And of course, one of the big things that is probably going to be an issue in the Senate race is the First Energy situation that sent Speaker of the House, Larry Householder, to prison for 20 years. Big scandal, the biggest bribery scandal in Ohio political history. Mm-hmm. And Lena, you're talking about the timing of this now, because we just had a trial that ended without a verdict.
Yeah, in a mistrial. And so the former executives, the CEO and vice president of First Energy, Chuck Jones and Michael Dowling, they were up on state corruption and bribery charges that ended in a mistrial. But that retrial is now scheduled for September 28th. And Jon Husted was a witness testifying for the defense, on behalf of Chuck Jones and Michael Dowling's defense attorneys. He didn't really say much in his testimony, denied, having any knowledge of any corruption or bribery, and always insisted that his focus was just to keep the First Energy nuclear power plants open. But the optics of it, especially if this retrial does in fact happen, of course, the defense attorneys are trying to move to have the case dismissed. But, in court, as of now, the retrial is set for September 28th. So close to the November election. And if Husted is called to testify again, the optics are bad.
They're awful. They're absolutely awful. To be testifying in a bribery trial where, in effect, you were one of the bribed parties, to be testifying for the defense. There's really nothing you would less rather have, with respect to talking earlier about media availability. Mm-hmm. Well, this is the absolute worst availability in the world,
right.
And you can't choose whether you're going to be there or not. And the other aspect of that, of course, is as energy prices skyrocket, the last thing you want to be is in a conversation where even in the most generous reading is you voluntarily raise the prices of energy on Ohioans. Even if you take bribery out of the equation, there's still a matter of moving $1 billion out of Ohioans' pockets and putting them in First Energy's pockets.
And, when we talked about the first trial, it was the timing a couple months before tonight's primary wasn't probably going to linger too much if it had been settled. But now this just opens it back up again with the possibility of a retrial.
And from Husted's perspective, there's just no good outcome, because the best case scenario is the accused bribers, are found not guilty, but you're still associated with this story and you're still in there defending and you're presenting yourself in the context of, as you said, the largest bribery scandal in Ohio political history, or at least the largest bribery scandal that we know of in Ohio.
And it's
history.
unlikely that the average voter is going to be tuning in to hear every moment of testimony to make their own decision on what they hear from.
Right.
And so what they'll see is the commercials that take pieces of it and turn
even
it
just
into
pictures
whatever you
of
want.
Husted walking into court. I mean, he avoided by testifying remotely, but it's going to be harder to pull that off when the Senate's out of session and you can't really tell the judge, I'm busy campaigning today. I don't want to go to court.
Yeah, there's still lingering questions linked to Husted as well. I mean, we did some reporting that showed that these First Energy executives had direct communications with Husted, and it was quote unquote called Houston Campaign was the note attached to $1 million in PAC money to a PAC called Freedom Frontier that was earmarked for the Husted campaign. Husted, of course, denies any wrongdoing. He says he had no idea, he knew nothing about Freedom Frontier. But nevertheless, there are still lingering questions and this association with the First Energy scandal.
And the difficulty with it, of course, is it's not just Husted, but DeWine, in the best reading, they still benefited from millions of dollars in a transaction that resulted in a energy company getting $1 billion. In the best reading, it was legal, but try making a stand, a political speech out of that.
But even the timing of the trial, it's like, as Stacia mentioned, you're going to hear about it in ads.
Right.
We'll see the ads.
And what campaigns are fundamentally about is what's the focus? What is the conversation about? And the absolute last thing you want to do is cede control of what the conversation's about. And even worse than that, cede control to having a conversation about bribery.
It's tonight is the primary, but we're already, of course, looking now ahead to November. That's what this is all about. It's like the playoffs and getting ready for the Super Bowl coming up in a few months. And so, we're watching this play out. Can the candidates even enjoy tonight? I mean, it's like, it is a victory.
Well, I think you made the good comparison, in sports. You win a game and the coach will say you can enjoy it tonight and then tomorrow we get back to work. I think for folks like Ramaswamy, for whom this is the first thing he's ever, the first major political victory, I think it's a nice night there. I think probably emblematic of the fact that Husted didn't even give a campaign speech. It's probably a pretty quiet celebration over there.
Yeah, I did talk with Vivek Ramaswamy earlier today when he voted, and it was it was one of the first things he said. He came out and he had his ballot with him before he put it in the reader, and he was like, first time I ever voted for myself. That was kind of cool.
See, and that's so interesting because we think of him as a candidate because he ran for president, but he never made it to the point where he could go and vote for himself. So that really was a significant moment.
Yeah.
And you heard the joy.
He got emotional about it.
You heard the joy in Dr. Acton's speech tonight. Like they're all taking a victory lap tonight for sure.
Right. Absolutely.
And then for her, it's getting back in the Jeep and starting to crisscross the state again. Of course, they're all going to probably try to hit the 88 counties again between now and November.
Absolutely. And for Ohioans, we're used to being the home of very, very competitive elections, and that kind of slipped away in some recent cycles. But 2026 looks to be the return of that, where Ohio matters again.